Good morning, students. Good afternoon or good evening, depending when you're watching this. Today we're going to be talking about evaluating credibility. This lecture will focus on different sources that disseminate research, different things to keep in mind when evaluating the credibility of these sources. So let's jump into it, shall we? So before we get into it, there are three categories we're going to be discussing: media articles, nonprofit and governmental organizations, and peer-reviewed academic journals, as you see on the screen. So research can be disseminated in several ways, and it's important to understand how to evaluate credibility of these different sources. One way that research is disseminated is through media. It's the big thing nowadays, right? Diffusion of information, whether that be through free-form video like TikTok, reading articles on websites and media critiques. This is just the general way that we consume media and information more than anything else these days. So this can include news articles, press releases, and articles shared via social media, things like TikTok, Instagram. Research can also be undertaken and shared via nonprofits and governmental organizations. The last most common way that research is disseminated is through peer-reviewed academic journals. These are big things, especially as you're in college, that if you're writing papers, you're not going to cite Wiki, you're going to cite one of these peer-reviewed journals, and it may be a requirement. And we will discuss each of these sources in more detail and factors to take into account when considering and determining credibility of sources, if you will. So when we're thinking of this, right, let's talk about these categories. Written by journalists, seek to share flashy information, may or may not accurately reflect research, and or may not have bias or agendas, right? Big deals to talk about here. So media articles are typically written by journalists who may or may not have familiarity with the topic they're writing about. Since journalists are not typically trained as researchers, they may not be familiar with the research methods and statistics used in research articles. You may have heard a common critique if you've ever written a paper, depending on how high of a level you've written it for, that you're sounding more journalistic than you're sounding academic. And it's said for a reason. Something that I dealt with in my early years in academia, that I wanted to kind of write in the way that I had seen, and the way I had seen was very much more accusational, more journalistic than it was exploratory. That's why it's really important to carefully evaluate the author of any article you're reading and look into their qualifications to be writing about certain topics, right? You don't just want somebody to speak on it. And that's a big deal right now, especially when you think about all the podcast genre we're in, all these people bringing in and acting like they are experts. They really may not have any expertise. So sometimes when this occurs, journalists focus in on one finding from a research study that may not accurately represent the overall message of the study. I mentioned this in an earlier lecture, that a student had read part of an article or watched a TikTok probably that discussed domestic violence inside same-sex couples, and had not read the full article and made generalizations that were disparaging and damaging. So it's important. But this person probably had this fun fact that they like to bring up that they read about, but they were not fully informed. This can happen in press releases, happens all the time, when the research from a study is being communicated to larger audiences, a kernel of truth. Now, some journalists do a really good job of translating research into media articles, but it's just not always the case that this is a happy bunch. There are people who don't do a good job, and this is why it's really, really important to evaluate the credibility of sources when we read research-based information, because it may not accurately reflect the research. Really important. Some sources may also have specific biases or agendas. Due to this, it's important to think about journalists' purpose for writing or reviewing the article, right? So when we discuss in this structure, we have nonprofit and governmental organizations that they may conduct and publish their own research. Happens all the time. I worked for them. Research may be guided by organization agendas rather than pursuit of knowledge. Research not subject to peer review, may not need to go through people who are critiquing and evaluating authenticity, and researchers may or may not have specific expertise on topics. So when we think of this, another common source is nonprofits and governmental organizations. This source differs from media articles because media articles typically report findings but do not conduct the research themselves, right? They are just telling what happened. While organizations may also conduct research themselves that they may then publish on their websites or or otherwise share with the public. You might have heard of a white paper, right? If you write on something and are able to kind of publish it yourself or through your org, it can count as something that you can say you did a white paper, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's been vetted. What organizations conduct research on is often influenced by an agenda and of the organization, but the specific aspects we'll discuss in Module 6 when we talk about research politics. So hold that, we'll come back to, we'll circle back. With regards to credibility, it's important to do some research on the organization themselves to see how qualified they are to conduct this type of research. I want to mention this. I talked about it in a few lectures ago. I did a large research study, 40,000 folks, looking at religious affiliation tied to the churches. I looked at dimensions of religion, Judaism, Catholicism, Christianity, non-affiliated, but I specifically focused on some of their data that would have been confounding to them, which was LGBTQ membership and how they felt about things. That wasn't what the research organization really wanted. That wasn't a part of their mission. So I was able to use that for my benefit as a sociologist, but they published around religiosity to what they wanted, not from here. So another thing to keep in mind is when we're doing this, we see that the research is often what the research is published directly to their website. It does not have to go through a rigorous peer review process that research published in our academics journals do. This means that research may be subject to some flaws and are not considered before the information is disseminated to the public. Topics investigated by organizations may focus on topics that are of most interest to the public instead of the topics which researchers have the most expertise. So you're trying to garner more people to be interested rather than the importance of the topic. So it's really important to look into the qualification of those individuals who specifically conduct the research if that information is provided. And this really does depend on the organization and who they staff to conduct research on certain topics. Information from these types of organizations can be a good source of information. It's just about making sure that we've done our due diligence. So, however, it is important to critically evaluate the sources to determine if you should or should not trust that said information, right? And then we get to the last slide of our lecture, articles written directly by a researcher. Researchers have topic-specific expertise, research subject to rigorous peer review process, and not often written for the general audiences. So let's circle into that, right? Let's dive in. So when it comes to research credibility, peer-reviewed academic journals will often have the most trustworthy information for several reasons. First, research published in these journals is written directly by the researcher who conducted the study. So there's a little bit more of a knowledge of the expertise. Due to this, the most accurate information about the study is likely to be shared since the research is coming directly from the source of translated and written by a journalist. Second, those who publish in academic journals tend to have specific expertise on a topic. It's likely the authors have advanced degrees in the field that have spent their careers studying a specific topic that they're publishing about, not just happenstance or what is the new topic of the month, right? So this makes them a knowledgeable and more trustworthy source within this topic, right? Articles published in academic journals are also credible because in order to be published in this type of journal, these articles must undergo a rigorous peer review process. This peer review process involves the article being shared and other researchers who have expertise on the topic as well. These outside researchers critically review the research and provide comments to the journal about the quality of said research, to the point where reviewer number 2 is a joke inside academia, that you are going to get critiqued. It's not going to be a bunch of high fives and good jobs. You're going to have somebody come in and challenge your findings, which is good. This result is only the best and the highest quality research studies being published in these journals. The percentages to getting published as you're going through, if any of you go towards doctorates, are very small. And the reason is because of this process. Often during this process, the researcher must revise the article several times to make sure it's of the highest quality. You're not just one and doneing it, right? The downside of research being published in academic journals is that these articles are not typically written with the general audience in mind. There's a long joke that you publish inside academia for your friends to read it, if they even do at all. It is one of the downsides, but it also means that a lot of this is focused on the data, the research, not on the clout. They can contain research-specific jargon, which is interpretive primacy, right? Using language that might not be common to most folks, and methods that may be difficult for those not trained in the research methods to understand, which does have a barrier of entry, which is one of the talking points by people when they try to point out issues behind college. That is why most people hear about research through other sources since academic journals are not the accessible ones to the general public. So it is important to have a generalizability and have ways to understand it, but we need to make sure they're citing that source. But it is important, again, also to be able to develop skills for reading academic journals because it will help you determine the accuracy of the information being shared by these other sources and increase your knowledge as a consumer. So, as we've talked about in this short lecture, evaluating credibility is a skill you're going to learn in this class. You need to preface it how you base your knowledge, your finding, and make sure that you're doing all of these things we've discussed about ways to engage with research. Because if you're not, then you're subject to what the article you're reading is saying, not what the facts are. So always evaluate your research. Make sure to use the tools you're learning in this class. I will see you in the next lecture. Till then.